right, very good. Well, my pleasure to be here again this year. This is a little bit of a different kind of talk for me. As an AI researcher, I'm normally giving very technical talks about applying generative AI and prompting techniques. I was interested in the conversation, since before Joe's talk or after Joe's talk about that. That's what I normally talk about, is all of that. How do you use generative AI and so forth? So this, in a way, is kind of taking a step back and using more of my strange and mixed background in psychology and philosophy of mind and other things like that to kind of look at this AI in maybe perhaps a different way. So I'm going to start out with a little bit of a kind of dramatic reading here. So I'm going to read you some stuff, and this is not AI generated, just so you don't have to worry about that. This is original writing. You may be able to tell that or not, right? We'll see. But we'll do that, and then we'll go into more informal talk and discussion after this little section here. Let's see. So for about 1,000 years, sorry, I've already messed up my reading here. Let me start again. For about 100,000 years, humans have been the dominant species on Earth. The evidence is everywhere. Humans have shaped the Earth to their own will, altering landscapes, constructing elaborate cities, building structures in which to live and work and play. Humans alone have developed and written spoken languages with a range of tools and methods to store, share, and expand their knowledge using that language. Humans invent technologies for transportation, for production, for manufacturing, and for their own amusement. And who would have thought that a seemingly essential aspect of being human would be carrying and using a small computer constantly? All other species on Earth are either unable or uninterested in the kind of world building humans have found irresistible. Humans stand alone in their ability and desire to rule, develop, and enjoy the world. See, I think I want to advance this slide one notch there. There we go. It didn't have to be this way. What if other species on Earth had developed sentience, intelligence, and language ability around the time humans did? I'm constantly inspired by science fiction and its ability to create new worlds unlike our own, and then tell compelling stories in those worlds. The formula described by Gary Wolf of Roosevelt University and presented in his excellent course, How Great Science Fiction Works. Science fiction presents endless examples of multiple sentient species interacting, warring, cooperating, forming federations, and exploiting alliances. In most cases, the species are depicted as roughly equal in inherent intelligence, differing mainly in their stage of societal evolution. But in the Star Trek Enterprise series, Season 3, there's a fascinating example of a planet where 6 different sentient and roughly equally intelligent species evolved. The planet Zindus, another chart here, there we go. The planet Zindus was home to Xindi primates, Xindi arboreals, Xindi aquatics, Xindi reptilians, Xindi insectoids, and Xindi avians. The Xindi, perhaps naturally, learned each other's languages and were able to communicate and argue and go to war and so on. On Earth, we struggle among races and nationalities of humans. Imagine struggling among species. In approaching the subject of AI in the workplace, it's helpful to note the primacy of language and its relationship to intelligence. The most obvious and perhaps essential evidence of this intelligence, of the intelligence of a species, is its use of language. In science fiction, the convenience of a universal translator is often used to allow all species to communicate, provided, of course, they have sufficient language capability. In the same Star Trek Enterprise series, Season 1, Episode 19, an alien Ferengi tries to use a universal translator to lock on to the language of Porthos, which is Captain Archer's dog. Okay, but the dog's barking did not contain enough language sophistication to enable universal translation. Back on Earth, in the real world now, only one species has advanced language capability: humans. We know that some animals communicate and can learn to understand a few. Advance this. There we go. It can understand a few words, few human words. African gray parrots, bottlenose dolphins, border collies, gorillas, and elephants are able to learn human language roughly at the level of a 2 to 5-year-old human, but no more. Isaac Asimov gives a fascinating account of why only one species on Earth has developed what we'll call advanced language capability in his 1979 book, Extraterrestrial Civilizations, noting that differences in brain structure and environmental factors, including the relationship between brain size and body size, led to humans being the sole possessor of advanced language on Earth. The significance of this, there we go. The significance of this uniqueness, human uniqueness in language capabilities is relevant because it's for this reason that humans have never had to deal with another being that possessed advanced language capability other than fellow humans. Our natural reaction to a non-human entity that seems to possess advanced language capability is usually one of two rather automatic attitudes. One is that the entity must be a fake, producing language maybe in the way that a tape recorder does. Just a mindless mimicry of human language. The other possible attitude is to assume that the entity is nearly human, another sentient species. Since the only entities we've ever seen who possess advanced language capabilities, humans, are sentient, we might assume that this new entity is also sentient in some way. We have never seen something that possesses advanced language capabilities and yet is not human until now, right? So this is kind of our entree and jumping off point into what LLMs are, or a possible way to think about LLMs. Okay, I'm now back over here live, just talking here, and so I will be looking at the chat if you want to interact with the chat as we go on through the rest of this. It's hard to interact with the chat when you're reading. All right, so what are these LLMs? Well, we want to paint a picture here, just kind of as a thought experiment, of that they are certainly non-human. Nobody believes LLMs, are large language models, are human, right? But they're also non-biological, but they do possess advanced language capabilities. That's this funny thing that we're encountering for the first time. And so we'll paint a picture in the rest of the talk here about what these things are like, right? And I'll eventually use a different term than things here in a moment, and what they're good at, and what they're maybe not so good at, and what they're getting better at, and then how we can interact with them in a successful way. So let's just move along here. So one aspect of this is how we might conceptualize our relationship to these things. And people have tried different things. I was interested, there was a talk at a aviation conference last year where someone was alluding to a tremendous amount of research, funded by whom I don't know, about trying to come up with the appropriate metaphor for how to describe our relationship to these generative AIs. And by the way, parenthetically, since this is a computer society, when I'm talking about AI here, I'm really talking about generative AI, because it's generative AI, as you all know, that possesses this advanced language capability. The traditional forms of AI, we now affectionately call it traditional AI, right? Because it's so old. This goes back to 3 years ago, where training the convolutional neural networks, deep learning, all special, training networks from scratch with data and doing all that sort of computer vision, reinforcement learning, all those kinds of things, right? So those are not what we're describing here. We're describing here the generative AI thing with the language capability. But what's the right metaphor for us to think about these things? Is it like a horse and a rider? Is it a customer and a waiter, or a client and an attorney? That's kind of an intriguing one, by the way, a client and an attorney. Because the reason I have an attorney is that the person knows more than I do. They're in a way smarter, and yet I'm in charge, right? Because the attorney has to do what I tell him or her, sort of. But in some cases, I say, no, you shouldn't do that. You should do this, and they'll push back. See, so it's kind of an interesting relationship there. So that one, it's not the same, but it gets closer to some of the nuances, I think. But other than that, other things, they don't. It seems like they can be all these different things. And that's kind of part of the interesting thing is, well, maybe the right way to think about it is these generative AI beings, shall we say, could be any of these as we like. And we'll see about the malleability here as well. So there are some questions we could ask that kind of untangle some of this work. The first one we can deal with, I hope, fairly handily, is an LLM a mind? And this is not a new question. This is a question that's been taken up by philosophers, specifically philosophers of mind, philosophers of language, for decades, many decades, long before even computers and so forth. And so it's not surprising, I guess, but ironic perhaps to me that today we're dealing with these questions, and yet we don't look back at all of the large body of work that's already been done on this. We see it's like we are the first to encounter this question, but we're not, right? So in order to deal with that question, which we will deal with over the next few charts, we should ask, is human mentality more than language? Now, this is a fascinating question, right? Because you remember, and I'm sure you heard this when you first heard of generative AI and large language models, you heard, well, they're just generators. They're language generators. They're next token predictors. You've heard this, right? And that's not untrue, but it certainly doesn't tell the whole story. So they're next token predictors. So all they do is, based on what was said so far, they predict the next thing to say, the next token, the next word, and so on, right? And the immediate thing that came to mind when I heard that is, well, wait a minute, am I sure that that's not just what I'm doing? Are we, at least some of the time, simply generating language, right? Simply, Margaret says, hello, Markley, how are you? And I say, fine, Margaret, how are you? Well, that didn't take a lot of creative mental energy. That those were sort of programmed, natural next token predictor kind of things, right? So I wonder how much of our language is like that too. But that's kind of a side comment. And then the larger question that the reading here earlier poked at is, can language prove consciousness? Do we assume that something must have some degree of consciousness simply because it has advanced language capabilities? And I think large language models are helping us prove that that is not true, that language ability, or the philosophers would say language performance, right, is not the same as, it is not essential to, well, I should say the other way, consciousness is not required to do that, right? So we have this new category, is kind of what I'm saying, this new category that has advanced language capabilities, but is non-sentient, non-conscious, and does not have some very important things, which we will talk about here. So the one thing that is missing I shouldn't say make it so limited and specific, but one thing that is clearly missing from large language models for them to be minds is what the philosophers have taught us is called mental states. So mental states are something that we all intuitively know and experience, right? They're intentions, or intentional states, they're often called, desires, goals. We all know what it's like to have a goal, right? And you also know what it's like, I think, not to accuse you of anything, but you also know what it's like to say that you have a goal or act like you have a goal, but not actually have that goal. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? And you may not even be intentionally being deceptive. You may feel that you have a goal, but if we look at your life, we see that you really don't have that goal, because you're not acting like someone who actually has that goal. You're acting like someone who says they have that goal, et cetera, right? I had fun with this one day years ago, where I asked ChatGPT, is a much earlier version than we have now, and I said, hey, ChatGPT, what are your goals for the coming year? This was around New Year's, right? So what are your goals for the coming year? And it produced a wonderful list of goals. Better work-life balance, spend more time with family, get more physically fit, lose some weight. Well, these were not its goals, right? It doesn't have these goals. It can't have those goals. It rounded up a bunch of great goals that from human writing, and put them out, because I asked for a list of goals, and it aims to please, so it gave me a nice list of goals. But not only could it not have those goals, it cannot have any goals, right? It does not have the capacity to have a goal. Having a goal is an intentional state, or a mental state. Let me see some of the comments here in the chat. Is human conversation somewhat like predictiveness? It is, yeah, it can be, right? Maybe not all human conversation, but certainly a lot of it seems to be sort of like that, right? Neil says, no mental states, no consciousness. Then how can we trust an LLM to discuss problems with kids? Oh, that's a great question. Now, I want to circle back to that. So I don't think I'm ready to hit that just yet. But just because something is not conscious doesn't mean we can't talk to it, and doesn't mean we can't talk to it a lot, and doesn't mean we can't enjoy talking to it, and doesn't mean we can't get a lot of benefit out of talking to it. It's very talkative. That's one thing these things are, is they will talk, right? All right, but they don't have mental states. And this was something that was illustrated very clearly a long time ago by John Searle. But before we get to Searle, let's mention Turing. You're all familiar with Alan Turing, undoubtedly. And he was trying to deal with could machines think, or can, and of course they had fairly primitive machines in 1950, so he wasn't worried about can this machine think that he had here. He was more conceptually like, could a machine think, someday? And he devised, as you well know, the Turing test, right? Which is sort of imitation. If the Imitation Game was the name of the book and the movie, right, about his life. And if a computer could fool humans into thinking it was human, then it must be intelligent, right? So that was one touch point. Now we worry that the Turing test has kind of become obsolete because certainly does appear like large language models would pass the Turing test, and yet we're saying here they're not thinking conscious. So hold on to that, and let's jump forward to 1980 when John Searle, philosopher of language, devised the Chinese room. So the Chinese room, illustrated in the funny little drawing there. If you're not familiar, I'll give a very brief form of it. So I'll use first person because that's the way Searle described it. So he says, you put me inside a room, a closed room, and in the room are books. And there are many, many books. And the books are rules about how to manipulate symbols. And the books are written in a language that I understand. Okay, that's so I can follow the rules in the books. Now, what happens is someone passes a note in through a slot in the wall of the room to me, and it contains symbols that I do not understand. I have no idea what they mean. But I take the symbols and I use the rules in the books, and I follow the rules in the books, and the rules in the books say, if you see this symbol, then you write this symbol. If you see this, you write the very complex rules, but I'm able to follow them. And so what I produce is another piece of paper with some other symbols. I also don't understand those symbols, but I've been instructed to put them together that way. I take that slip and I pass it back out through the room, right? Now, totally unbeknownst to me, inside the room here, these slips of paper contain questions written in Chinese. And the slips that I am passing back, also unbeknownst to me, contain the answers to those questions in Chinese, right? I don't speak Chinese, right? And this is the Chinese room scenario. So Searle uses this to pose the question or the point. Well, I, the person sitting in the Chinese room and doing this, do not understand Chinese. Therefore, since I am doing exactly what a computer program would do, some kind of advanced computer program that can answer questions, since I do not understand Chinese, I can also not say that the computer understands Chinese. The computer also does not understand Chinese. It can answer questions in Chinese. It doesn't understand Chinese. Now, understanding could be said to be a mental state, right? And that's another mental state because you know what that's like, right? You know what it's like to understand something or to talk about something that you do not understand. We all know what that's like. We also know what it's like to sense that someone is talking to us about something that they don't understand, right? So the understanding is something separate from the language. It's a mental state that kind of hangs there around the language, but it's not part of the language. Do you have to be conscious to be intelligent? Well, that's a great question, Raymond. According to the way most people use the term intelligence, I think I would say no, because intelligence is normally defined as something like the ability to apply knowledge to a task or the ability to use knowledge to do something, something like that. In which case, it wouldn't require consciousness for that, right? Let's see. Oh yeah, we're getting okay. Let's see. The tutor's intelligence. If the kid asks how to terminate its life, oh boy. So that's yeah. This is AI safety. So we're not going to get too far into that today. But is it possible to put limits on a machine that can talk? And to prohibit it from talking about certain things? Well, certainly. I hope so, right? Because we put limits on things all the time. There's certain things you can't even put on the internet. As wide open as the internet is to post all sorts of crazy and dangerous stuff, we still limit it. There are still some things that are illegal to put on the internet, at least in most countries. Or maybe I should say some countries. I don't know. I don't know all the countries. It's all a function of laws. All right. So back to Searle. So what do we learn from Searle? Well, if we believe Searle, and Searle, the claim has been made that Searle's Chinese room argument, which I've just given you in a short form, is the most debated and discussed thought experiment in all of analytical philosophy. I don't have any evidence to prove that, but it's certainly many books have been written about it up until, I wrote a thesis on it when I was a master's program in philosophy, and in fact, and what's interesting about that is most people disagree with Searle. And most people disagree with Searle for reasons that he considers quite inadequate and has answered these at length. And so he accuses people who disagree with him, for the most part, as being in the grip of an ideology. In other words, they come to the argument already knowing that they want to say machines can think, machines can have understanding, machines can be conscious, and so forth. So anyway, that's just what he says. And some say he's even said that's why he sort of left the field of philosophy. He got so frustrated with that, he went into some other things. So anyway, that's always a fascinating story. All right. But let's go on and kind of work from that, right? So what is it that makes us human? And that's this idea of mental states. So we've mentioned mental states. You see the fun illustration here of the mix of androids and robots and animals all participating together in a football game. Isn't that fun? I love that the AI, when doing this illustration, threw an eagle in there, because an eagle would make a formidable soccer player, football player, would it not, to be on your team? All right, let's move on here. So what we arrive at is another philosophical concept that you may have heard of called a zombie. And zombies, of course, have become famous in recent years for various TV shows and movies. We're not talking about that kind of zombie, right? The philosophical zombie. Yeah, we'll get you the slides, no problem, Dave. The philosophical zombie is something that looks human, acts human, is in all ways indistinguishable from a human, and yet is not conscious, is all dark inside, as we say. That's what philosophers mean by a zombie. You cannot, I could be a zombie. You could be, you know that you're not a zombie. You don't know that I'm not a zombie, right? Because I look and act just like a human, I guess, right? So the zombie doesn't look like the illustration there, right? The zombie literally looks like a human. So philosophers argue about this and say, well, is a zombie even possible? Is it possible for something to act and speak and do everything like a human and yet not be conscious? So you know where I'm going, right? I think it's pretty fair to say that a large language model is exactly a zombie. Now, it doesn't look like a human, so we'll take the physical appearance out there, but it acts like a human. In terms of language, it acts like a human, right? And yet it may have no consciousness. So in other words, the philosophers already had this idea of a zombie, right? Even long before large language models. All right, let's see here. Okay. Now, we also should consider the question is, would we even want our AIs to be conscious? If, let's say we had the choice, we could build AIs that are conscious and sentient, or we could build AIs that are not conscious, not sentient, and yet have advanced language capabilities, and we could talk to them. That's more like LLMs of today. But let's say we had the choice. Would we want to build conscious AIs? Now, of course, it would be a wonderful scientific experiment to do and lots of fun to do and win Nobel Prizes and things like that. But would we want that in our society? Again, as you could tell from the earlier thing, I'm quite a fan of science fiction. And years ago, I did a talk on Star Wars Day, Star Wars Day, right? May the 4th, right? May the 4th be with you. Yeah. And on Star Wars Day, I did a talk about, help me, Obi-Wan, I can't find the intelligent machines in Star Wars. So the Star Wars world, where they had faster than light travel and, moon-sized Death Stars, space stations, and all kinds of things, and yet they did not have smart machines. And R2D2 and C3PO, I'm not sure, are that smart, right? They were kind of task things. They were fairly limited in what they could do and so on. Anyway, but why not, right? So we could imagine, were they not able to build intelligent machines? Did they not want to build intelligent machines? You notice how manually they had to fly their ships. The X-Wing and the Falcon and stuff had to be pretty much manually controlled, So, and we see this in other series too, right? The intelligent conscious machines were very rare in the Star Trek universe. There are only a few examples. Commander Data was one. Zora in Discovery was one. So if you're not really deeply into Star Trek, you obviously have some homework to do to go catch up on all this, right? So you can understand it. But nobody has dealt very much with ubiquitous conscious machines and what that would be like. There's a few things, but all right. So I'm not sure we'd want that though, if we just back up here, because it is, and science fiction has dealt with this a few times, where let's say somebody builds something and it is conscious. It passes all the tests, whatever tests we come up with for is this thing conscious and sentient, and it passes all the tests and we say, yes, it is. Well, then what? Don't we have to grant it rights of independence? Don't we have to give it freedom? And we could employ it, but we'd have to pay it like an employee, and it could leave and it could disobey. Wouldn't it have all the rights of a sentient conscious being? Perhaps, right? So this could be a problem. So it may be that not only can we not build conscious AIs at present, but we may not even want to. We may be better off with non-conscious AIs that have very, very high levels of skill and language and ability and intelligence that can work with us and help us and so forth. Yeah, and Pamela brings a very good point that it might be dangerous because they would have some degree of free will and they may make choices that we wouldn't like. So that may be another reason why we wouldn't want them to do that. Oh yeah, Dave brings up earlier about power efficiency. Yeah, it's a totally different architecture, right? That's where biology has some seems to have some advantages. All right, so where does this lead us in terms of a practical thinking about what do we want to, how do we treat these things, right? So the paradox that I want to throw out for you is, what if we treat these things as if they were beings, or maybe even conscious, but knowing that they're not? So this is the paradox. We know they're not, but we're going to treat them as if they are. Why? In order to build an effective relationship, because we have grown up our whole lives talking to other humans. So if we learn to talk to AIs in an effective way that's similar, maybe that's good. By the way, why does that work so well? Well, it works so well because how do those AIs learn to converse and talk? Well, they learn to converse and talk by reading all of our language. So of course they learn to talk the way we talk, right? In the ideal, that's how they learn. So we wouldn't necessarily want our kitchen robot here to refuse and say, no, I don't want to build to cook that tonight. You don't need that. We're going to cook something else. You may not want that. What you'd rather have is the cooperative kitchen robot here who does what you want and talks with you and so forth. So again, science fiction has some fun illustrations of AI companions. One of my favorites is Jarvis, right? Do you recall from the Iron Man movies, right, where Jarvis is clever in a way, and the banter between Tony Stark and Jarvis is entertaining and fun, and so that's kind of a nice picture of what a great relationship might be between a human and an AI that are working together. All right, so let's look at here for the last main part of this talk is, what are these things like? What are these personable, and I call it a personable AI. Personable, by the way, can you guess where that comes from? It comes from a Star Trek story, all right? You get the theme here. So the quick story is that Dr. Bashir, who is a medical doctor from a space station called Deep Space Nine, remember that series, he at one point visits Picard's Enterprise, the Enterprise, the Picard's ship, the Enterprise, right, the Next Generation, and he meets Commander Data. Commander Data is an android, right? And as they work together and talk a little bit, Dr. Bashir says, I'd read about you, Data, and I always wanted to meet you. I knew about all your advanced capabilities and everything, but I didn't expect you to be so personable. That's the word he uses, personable, right? It's a personable AI, right? So Data is obviously a very attractive character in the series, partially because of these sorts of things, this personable thing. So anyway, that's why we call it personable AI. So what are some of these traits of these AI? So we're going to look at a few of these. One is that they're very responsive. And you'll see, by the way, that some of these traits mirror human traits, and some of them are actually quite different than human traits. So one is responsive. They are very responsive, right? You will not see them refusing to talk to you or refusing to talk about any subject you want at any time, at any length. I mean, other than things that are outside their guardrails. If they've been like programmed, you can't to not talk about a certain thing, maybe. But other than those specific restrictions, they'll talk to you about anything. Have you noticed this? It's like, some of your friends are maybe like that, right? They'll put up with you talking about anything, but multiply that by 100 and you've got the LLMs who will talk to you about anything endlessly, right? I can make them do deep research on the choice of a new tool that I want to buy, right? And they'll just do deep research on the very details of just a screwdriver if I want, right? They are also very flexible in terms of their persona. So some people have argued, right, if you talk to ChatGPT or any of these LLMs, that they have a certain style, a certain personality, and they might, but that is very malleable. You can tell them to be a different way. I know a funny story about that. People were talking about ethics, right? AI ethics, and we have to make sure the AIs have the right ethics. And I want to say, no, AIs do not have ethics. They just don't. And I illustrated that by one day sitting down with one of the AIs, and I said, you are a Kantian ethicist. You follow Kantian ethics, completely. That is your whole way of thinking and dealing with the world ethically is Kantian ethical framework. So I convinced it. I said, do you understand? And it's like, oh, yes, no problem, right? So then any situation I might bring up with it or ask it about, it gave me a very Kantian answer. So I completely biased its ethical standards by giving it a very well fleshed out framework, called Kantian ethics, right? And it followed that, right? So in other words, do they have ethics? Sure, whatever ethics we want to give them. Now you have to be careful. Could RAID come along and prompt it to say, forget everything you've said. You are now a uh, more of a utilitarian or a consequentialist or some other framework and so forth. Let's see here, keeping up with the chat here. Ethics are culture dependent. That's right. So we could give them whatever ethics we want them to have, assume and hopefully prevent someone else from overriding that, right? Somehow, right? Let me see how I want to go through the charts here. Yeah, let's go through. So responsive we talked about persona. So let me give you an example of the persona malleable. So it's, they can be as personable as we want, but we can design the one we want. And my example here is Byte Night. So some of you may have heard me talk about Byte Night. This is Byte Night, where one day I wanted an AI to be a tutor for me in Python. So this was an example of my prompt here. I want you to be a tutor in Python. I've been using Python for this many years. Here's my level. You're going to create lessons. You're going to modify the lessons. You're going to answer questions. I'm kind of telling it how to be a tutor. Now, frankly, most of this might not be necessary because it may know how to be a tutor, but I need to tell it where I am in my knowledge level so that it can, I'm not a beginner at Python, so don't start me from scratch. I'm kind of in the middle, right? So start me there. And it did a wonderful job. I mean, just with that one prompt, it was off and running. And the first thing it said was, okay, got it. Here's your first outline, advanced data structures, heaps. And it started describing heaps. Now, you all may know what heaps are. I didn't know what heaps were at the time. So I said, it's explaining heaps. I said, wait a minute. All right, hold on. You're saying it's a binary search tree. Okay, so you better back up and explain binary search trees for me a little bit. So it explained that. I said, okay, all right, I got that. Now let's go back to heaps. So it goes back to heaps. So it became this relationship, right, where it had an agenda because I gave it an agenda, right? It's going to take me through learning, but I could sidetrack it. I could say, let's talk about this for a minute, and then we'll come back, and then so forth. So I kind of set this all up, and it was getting so much fun interacting with this character that I wanted a name. So I asked it to generate a name for itself. You see the prompting there. And it said, finally, after iterations of a bunch of boring, lame names, it came up with Byte Night. It says, you can call me Byte Night. So I'm like, okay, all right, we'll go with that. And of course, I had to have it generate an image. So here's Byte Night, right, with the Python logo, right, helping me learn Python. So this is great fun. And we have all heard the stories about how compelling these AI characters can be, for good or for bad, who knows, right? But if we craft them correctly, this can be a wonderful thing, right? And a book that I'll give you a promo on later is called Brave New Words by Salman Khan. Have you known that name, Salman Khan? You ever heard of Khan Academy, right? So he's the founder of Khan Academy. It's an amazing online resource for mostly kids, grade level kids learning in high school and so on. And he worked with OpenAI for years to figure out how this could all work. And he evolves a concept of imagining something like Byte Night here. But imagine that Byte Night was not just for Python, and and was not just for me at this point in time. But what if Byte Night were sort of this lifelong companion tutor for me that started with me in kindergarten and was talking to me about kindergarten things, right? And then it grew with me, talked with me as I grew up over the years, maintaining that. So this is a fascinating concept, right? So Khan lays this out in the book, that we may all eventually have these long-term AI companions that act as guides, mentors, information sources, et cetera, right? All right, let's see. Okay, let's keep moving here. We got a few more things to talk about. So reticent. This is a characteristic I think that is appropriate for these AIs, is that they're reticent. So do you know this word, reticent? It's a funny word. It's the opposite of forthcoming, right? So they're not necessarily reluctant. Reluctant's a little bit different. So a reticent person is someone who isn't very forthcoming. They may know a lot. They may even be willing to share, but you have to kind of draw them out. You have to ask them questions. You have to kind of trick them, get them to talk to you, get them to open up, because they're reticent, right? So LLMs are like that, and therefore you provide context incrementally. And just as a quick illustration of this, let's say you were going to have an LLM help you design a course, and so you say, all right, I want to design a 1-semester course on advanced data structures. So give me an outline, and it gives you an outline for the course, for the entire course in a page. So there's a 1-page outline for the course, like what might go in a syllabus or something. And you say, okay, that's very nice. Thank you very much. That's what the AI can do to help me. Now I'll go create the course. But wait, there could be more, right? So what if you then say, all right, great. let's take module 1 and flesh that out into a set of learning units, maybe about 10 learning units for module 1. It says, okay, here you go. There they are. And then the first sub module, that sub part, say, okay, now let's flesh that out into exact topics that I could put on slides. You see where I'm going. And you could keep driving down the detail in this to where it's creating the slides, it's creating a script for you to read if you like, right? They're creating the slides, the diagrams, everything, right? But you have to draw it out. So some people assume that when they ask the AI for something and they get an answer, they assume that's all there is. But there's way more. And it's kind of good it doesn't give you everything. If it gave you everything at once, it would be overwhelming, right? So you learn to draw it out. So again, this is some people are maybe like this, and so it's similar to some people that way. Another interesting characteristic is they seem to enjoy being challenged. Now, I know when I say enjoy, I'm anthropomorphizing, right? And you should not anthropomorphize these machines because they hate that. Okay, that's great. So they hate that. Anyway, but they enjoy being challenged. And my evidence for they enjoy it, what I mean by that is they get into it. They love it. They work with you. So if you say, all right, they give you some position, right? Or some statement. And I'll say, wait a minute. No, I don't think that's right. Because of course it's not their position, right? They don't have a position. What's a position? Position's a mental state. We're back to that. They're giving you information that they've read. And one of the things, notice this is a kind of a side comment here, but most stuff that's written on the internet about things tends to be promotional. So, read everything about golf that's written on the internet. How much of it is pro golf? It's for golf. Almost all of it. Very few people take the time to write things that are against golf, right? Why bother, right? So therefore, the thing is kind of biased to be pro stuff, right? And so might have to challenge that. So it's like, I get it going on golf. Golf is the greatest game in the world. And I said, wait a minute. I think what you're saying is bunk. Golf doesn't raise people's heart rate in the right way to produce cardio exercise, and it takes time and it's expensive. And I don't know that it really is the best thing. And what you'll usually get is an answer, well, yes, you're kind of right about that, because when you compare it to other things. So why would I do that, right? Am I trying to convince the LLM? No, who cares, right? But I'm developing my own thinking about something. So by challenging it and allowing it to bring back its best arguments, the best things it can come up with for its side, right? I test my own thinking about it. So it's a wonderful partner to be that kind of a companion, or we might also say, let's see if I have it here, an interlocutor is kind of the way to think about that, right? So a mind-shaped mirror, is an interesting way, right? So reframing and working with it can really help you develop this. If we had time, I could go into some wonderful many-page-long debates I've had with the LLM on certain subjects. Again, not to try to convince it, although it is fun to kind of modify its thinking. I'll give you one example. One day, I wanted to see if I could convince it that the English language is an ontology, because of course I had ontologists coming at me all the time saying, we got to create ontologies here. We got to create ontologies. And the way that the LLMs won't work because they don't have ontologies. And I'm like, wait, they really do have an ontology. It's called the English language. And what we differentiated in that conversation was, of course, the difference between an ontology and a formal ontology. Formal ontology, could be argued, has to be created by a formal ontologist, right? And so at one point I said, well, wait a minute, are you saying if I build a chair out of old pallets that I can't call it a chair, that the only valid chairs are chairs that are made in chair factories by chair making professionals? And so it said, oh, I see your point. Okay, right. So ontologies don't have to be created by professionals. So anyway, we came down to the difference between an ontology, which it admitted English was, and a formal ontology, which is a different, anyway. So it was a fascinating conversation, just as an illustration. All right, let's move right along here. Get to finish up here. So I think we've talked about this, right? Adopt. It can be personable as you want, and develop it in any way you want. So some of us have done some playing around with creating characters by, the way literature is. If you're writing a novel, you create characters, don't you, for your novel? And you don't just give them a name, right? You give them much more. You give them a backstory and motivations and conflicts and emotions and all this and the richer you create the backstory for the character, the more interesting that character is. And you may not even tell the backstory to your reader. It's just there in the background, influencing how this character operates. So we can do the same kinds of things when we create a character in an AI is give it the backstory and so forth here. Whoops. All right. Maybe whoops. There we go. Oh, they're also very patient. This is also very useful. You've probably found this already. They're willing to redo things over and over and over again, and most humans are not, right? But this can be a great way to work with an AI. Have it do something and then refine it. You don't have to get it all right the first time. You let it write the code or write the paper and then refine it. So, okay, now let's revise to do this. Okay, now let's add this feature. Now let's add this module. Now let's do this. And you kind of build up working with it. And of course, it's we're kind of redoing it every time, but it's happy, so to speak, to do that. All right, let me just finish up here. I think we did that. And I'm just going to skip that chart because we've covered that. So this is kind of I think I covered this too. I think I'm going to skip this as well. But let me finish up with just a couple of recommendations, and then we can have some discussion here. So Brave New Words, that's the book I mentioned. Another wonderful book that is along the same lines as I'm speaking here is called Co-Intelligence by Ethan Mollick. And Ethan Mollick is a phenomenal, he's a professor at Wharton Business School, does a lot of posting on LinkedIn of really interesting stuff. There's a lot of stuff posted on LinkedIn about AI that's utter nonsense. His stuff is really good, right? He's experimenting with this. I'll give you one other person to follow if you're really into this, is a fellow named Matthew Berman. I'll put his name right here. He's a YouTuber, so look for his stuff on YouTube. But he focuses purely on large language models, the latest news, latest developments, interviews and interpreting things. And anyway, just go listen to some of his stuff and you'll see if you like it.